for a discussion of the implications for domestic manufacturers of President Biden's executive order to review critical supply chains. I'm joined by two experts from Kroll. Daniel Hartnett is Associate Managing Director with the Compliance, Risk, and Diligence practice. Hello, Dan.
Hello, Bob. Great to be back today.
Thank you very much. And Stacy Scott is Managing Director in the Cyber Risk practice. Stacy, also welcome back.
Hi, Bob. Good to see you.
Let me start with you, Dan, just for a broad answer to the question of what are the implications for domestic manufacturers of President Biden's executive order on reviewing critical supply chains?
So I think it's a great question, and it's really the primary question everyone should be thinking about in the manufacturing sector right now. And I think the answer is it depends. It depends upon exactly what comes out in the back end of these review. Remember, these are reviews right now, right? They're actually not any policy changes yet. So depending upon what comes out in the back end, but also depend upon what sector specifically we're talking about, right? It's not going to impact all manufacturers across the board. You'll really be looking at a subset. Those are deemed most critical or most important to U.S. national security, national and economic security.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was starting with 4, but then be expanding beyond that after the initial 100
6 more after that. That's very broad encompassing.
Yeah.
That's correct.
Yeah. What do you think is the cyber risk contingent of that, Stacy?
Yeah, I think with any kind of review and attention at a national or global level comes attention from the bad guys, right? So while they're under review, they may be the target of more cyber attacks, and or after the review and some action is proposed or approved to be, undertaken, they may again receive more attacks in the way of attacks on their cyber infrastructure, on their supply chain infrastructure, but also communications. So I think it's just to know that when you're put under the spotlight, the bad guys are seeing it as well.
Dan, what did we learn during the pandemic of the biggest weaknesses and shortfalls of the U.S. domestic manufacturing base?
I think there's 2 major ones that I would highlight. The first and foremost is the one we've seen repeatedly in the past year, just a lack of visibility, right? Beyond the immediate first or maybe even second tier supplier, right? Not really knowing who's in the end-to-end supply chain, more importantly, where they're located. And that leads into the second biggest takeaway is that notion of this over concentration of risk, right? Where you have the geographic perspective, for example, where you might have not only a second tier supplier in jurisdiction X, but also several third and fourth tier suppliers feeding into them so that if something happens in that one jurisdiction, all of them go down, and that brings your entire supply chain network down.
Mm-hmm. Of course, that can apply not just to domestic manufacturers, but manufacturers in general, especially those with extended supply line and even less visibility there. Stacy, where did clearly we knew already that there were cyber weaknesses in these supply chains, but what in particular kind of was the most glaringly obvious in retrospect as a result of the pandemic?
Yeah, I think it's largely that you don't know the cyber robustness of your third parties and fourth parties, right? In that supply chain. And to Dan's point, you don't know who they might be or where they're located. You also don't know if they have the proper controls and requesting. Do you have these things? What do you have in place is also difficult. It's really difficult. And to some degree, people don't want to share what their controls are because then they could be leaked, or it's just one more place where that information is out there to get into the wrong hands and have access and attack you by, hey, they have this, but they don't have these controls in place or these, security mechanisms in place. Let's go ahead and target those guys. So it's a lack of transparency, but also the need to keep it a little bit private. It's kind of I think it'll continue to be a pitfall for
Stacy, what were some of the more prevalent techniques that cyber hackers adapted during the pandemic?
It's remote access. We all went home, we all managed remote, and to adjust for capacity, many technology teams had to set up access and bandwidth for remote access very quickly. And I think most of them did it very well. Some did it maybe and didn't consider all security controls that you would want them to consider. But also as we moved back into a hybrid, or people moved around, or now people are going into the office slowly or part-time, those remote access mechanisms aren't used as much anymore. And so we've seen attackers hack a remote access protocol that wasn't being used anymore and wasn't being monitored because they set it up, but now it's not being used, but they haven't taken it down. And so nobody's looking at it, nobody's using it, and there's an easy way in.
Unfortunately, it seems to be the case with human nature and business nature that maybe the real lessons don't get learned except in times of disaster and disruption. Dan, what have supply chains learned from this pandemic? You described a little bit of the problem, but what lessons have they taken away that they might be able to deploy in future to improve their lot?
Yeah, that's a good question there. And I think that they're still learning, right? Let's be honest. We're still in the process of turning, lessons into lessons learned, as I would say, drawing from my military time. But I think there's 4 key things to highlight that I've seen companies talk about and what they need to do more of going forward. And I'm already beginning to. First and foremost is increase that visibility, what we talked about, right? Make sure they're understanding who's in their end-to-end supply chain, who are their suppliers being supplied by, right? And the second one, it correlates to that, is having that stronger communication up and down the supply chain, right? Don't just talk to your immediate suppliers. Make sure you're also talking to tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers and beyond if necessary, in almost real time if possible. I think the third one is to be a little more proactive in a risk management perspective, right? Don't wait until problems happen, but go out and look for them and see if you can put in controls to minimize impact. You can never eliminate it, but you can at least minimize the impact. And finally, I think the biggest lesson is just the prioritization of risk and risk management overall, right? Always played second fiddle for most industry sectors. But we've seen now that risk has come front and center. There are C-suite individuals responsible for risk management now, if not even members of the board. I think it's a good thing in the long run.
Yeah. Stacy, on the cyber risk side, we never lacked for warnings and supposed lessons from experts such as yourselves who are only too ready to tell us after an attack what the company A or company B did wrong. Where is the actual wake-up call this time around? Do you think that companies might actually be embracing a level of awareness about cyber risk that they might have given lip service to before, but now they really need to apply?
Yeah, no, that's a great way to put it. I was just thinking, boy, we've all dreamt up these scenarios that could happen, and now which ones have come to fruition or likely have higher risk now. So we're going to pay attention. And I really think it is the fact that so many folks have experienced an incident or a data leak or business disruption, and or have experienced business disruption because of the supply chain during the pandemic and issues with that, and not knowing, and now thinking, there's a lot of attention around this. Am I doing the right things? It becomes a regulatory issue because a lot of regulatory agencies are now requiring and have been requiring third-party reviews from a cyber perspective. And I think people and companies haven't really dug that deeply into it widespread because it's a monster to tackle. You have potentially a ton of vendors and third parties and fourth parties that you work with, and to manage that is difficult. You have to triage through what's the most critical, what's going to have the most business impact on our business if something happens or we're attacked from that third or fourth party. So I think the realization of this is real, and we've experienced the delay in the pandemic, and it affected revenue typically, right? When it affects revenue or the bottom line, that's when people start to pay attention. And I think some of the disruptions in the supply chain cyber attacks have affected people's bottom line, and now they're paying attention.
Dan, I liked what Stacy just referred to as a monster in terms of something huge to tackle. And even if you get beyond cyber risks, even more on the plate of domestic manufacturers. How are they going to prioritize their changes and reactions? I mean, from the very basis of changing where they manufacture, or maybe reshoring or bringing stuff back to, there's so many things they could be doing. How do you prioritize and decide what should happen first, second, third, and fourth in order to make all these adjustments?
Yeah, you can't do it all, right? It's just too costly. You run your company into the ground. So you have to kind of risk base it and look at where are the most critical issues, where are the most sensitive threats, who are the most critical suppliers, and it may not necessarily be driven by pure revenue alone, right? They may only supply one small widget, but if that widget's missing, you can no longer function, right? You can't meet your client needs. So you have to risk base it, but you need to look at it from a whole of enterprise perspective. Otherwise, if you're only looking at it in small pieces without the bigger picture, you will fail ultimately because something will catch you by surprise, unfortunately.
And Stacy, where do the biggest physical security threats to domestic manufacturing or general manufacturing supply chains exist today? Is it in people? Is it in technology? Is it in third parties? Where's the big threat that needs to be addressed right away?
Yeah, from a physical perspective, I think it's transport, and the technology that is used to track that transport, right, from here to there, and communication between your third, fourth parties up through the chain to your company is going to be the biggest thing. Dan, I think, mentioned communication is going to be key. It also needs to be secure communication, because that could get disrupted. You get bad information or no information, and that could cause disruption to your supply chain and to your manufacturing. And I want to add on what Dan was saying about, kind of, risk-based, splitting these guys up, looking at what would affect your business the most, not necessarily with revenue. Taking that one second layer again is then look at it from a cyber or technology perspective. We've got our list of most critical to our business and functioning. Now, which ones have most access to our data? Do we communicate most with, that we're most connected to our technology or their technology? And where do those risks lie as well, to add that cyber layer on top of that business layer that he's talking about?
Yeah. Well, I would certainly hope, and we could all hope, that this review won't end up in a book on a shelf somewhere and not be addressed. But it sounds like maybe this is a real opportunity for action on the part of domestic manufacturer supply chains, and also in terms of cyber risk. Daniel Hartnett, Stacy Scott, both of Kroll, thank you so much for being with me today to discuss these critical issues.
My pleasure. Thank you, Bob.